My name is Brandon Campbell, and I'm a Director of Business Development at Ephesoft. Over the next 15 minutes, I'm going to walk through the Ephesoft approach to managing unstructured documents related to contracts and agreements through our Intelligent Content Capture platform. I'll also hop into a deep dive of the application to show you how it works in action. Now, Ephesoft's focus is on unstructured documents and records. And the reason we focus on this very specific area of content within an organization is because up to 80% of corporate data exists in unstructured formats. That means those documents and records, whether they be contracts, agreements, sales terms, partnership agreements, or non-disclosure agreements, stored within your organization's document and records management systems, or file shares, or cloud storage, contain incredibly valuable information, valuable data that is not necessarily useful or searchable to an organization when it exists in that unstructured format. And so the goal of the Ephesoft platform, our mission, is to take the chaos of all of that unstructured content, to provide order to all of those documents and records through a series of classification and extraction algorithms, and then to provide enlightenment to the end users and the business units through that structured data. Now, we enable the extraction and sorting and classification of unstructured content and unstandardized formats of documents through multidimensional analysis. That means that we look at all of the text on a page, whether it exists in the form of a services agreement or a partnership agreement or sales terms, and we look for key pieces of information that exist within the content, patterns that might be represented by different data types, anchor values that might exist around pieces of information, and we take all of that information into consideration to start to assign a learning model to different document types so that the application can intelligently learn and capture unique pieces of information based on sample information or sample documents that we've provided and input that we've given to the application for direction. Now, without further ado, what I'd like to do is hop into a quick demonstration to show you how the actual Ephesoft platform works live when we're interacting with some unstructured contents and documents and records. So I have a series of sample contracts here that I'm going to use for training and demonstration purposes. Everything from sales agreements to contract amendments to subcontract agreements, all located in or existing in various formats. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through how we would interact with these documents to extract key pieces of information for records management purposes, for retention policies, for compliance purposes. The screen you're looking at right now represents the home or main menu, which details all of the available projects that I have access to as the owner or a contributor for a project that's been shared with me by a colleague. I'm going to open up my contract processing project to walk through how we would work with unstructured documents like contracts in a real-world situation and how we would give input into the application in order to create the learning model that allows us to process those documents automatically. So on this project home screen, I have a couple of tiles available to me here. I'm going to focus primarily on this teach tile, which is where I'll walk through the provision of some sample documents and how we use those sample documents to train the application to learn how to deal with contracts. But a couple of other points to note. This crawl tile is where I would configure the different points of content ingestion, where I would automatically have the application pull in new documents or records, archival documents and records from wherever they exist within the organization or somewhere on the cloud. And this upload tile is how I manually uploaded a handful of sample documents in order to provide the application with some background documents for training purposes. So I'm going to click on this teaching tile, which gives me a list of what we call teaching jobs. And in aggregate, these individual teaching jobs define the learning model for how we interact with the documents that this project is going to process automatically. I have a couple of teaching jobs that I've already finished and a couple of in-progress jobs that I'll walk through to show you how we build the learning model. So if I open up one of these in progress teaching jobs, I have sample documents that I've manually uploaded here on the left, and I have document types that I've defined simply by selecting Add Document Type here on the right, represented by these folder icons. In order to start giving input into the application on how to interact with this content, all I have to do is hover over the thumbnail of one of these sample documents. In this case, I have an amendment to an agreement. Click that field or click that document and drag and drop the thumbnail into the appropriate location of this document type I've created. So I've got a first page here and a variable last page, which I'll train as a middle page, and a couple of other document types. Now, typically in a production environment, we recommend training somewhere between 7 and 10 samples per document type, depending on the variability. We do not need hundreds and hundreds of unique samples in order to give the application a good representation of variation, because we are using machine learning in order to process this content. So it looks like I've got a master contract agreement here for a subcontractor. So again, I'll simply drag and drop the document type into where it needs to be. And when I've trained as many of these thumbnail samples as I want, I'll move on to the next stage, which is moving from training to testing. And this is where I have the opportunity to give live feedback to the application in order to verify whether or not document types have been trained correctly. And so this is where we start to talk about the idea of supervised machine learning, where I'm giving some input into the application to say, this is how I would like content to be processed. And then the application is going to turn around and give me its feedback based on the parameters that I've defined to say, am I doing this correctly, essentially. It's a bit like an iterative conversation with technology. So I'd start off, I manually trained this amendment agreement so we know it's where it needs to be. But what about this subcontractor agreement? I only dragged and dropped one page of the document over, but it looks like it defined another one of these sample documents as a subcontractor agreement as well. And if I click on the middle page box here, I can see all of the other pages that represent a part of these different document types have been put into where they need to be. However, if I'm not satisfied, maybe in fact this particular document isn't in fact a subcontractor agreement, maybe it's a listing agreement or something along those lines, I would simply drag and drop this page into its appropriate location, giving more input into the system to tell it where information needs to go. Now, hopping back out of this teaching job, I want to open up another pending teaching job wherein we're in a different stage of the process. And in this case, I have, more of these agreements. I have this amendment agreement here, and I'm going to show you how I would actually define the different fields that I would want to use for extraction purposes. Now, this is incredibly important when we talk about contract management, because we want to be able to pull out these different pieces of information from these contracts in order to use for purposes of records retention, for compliance purposes, maybe for review of contracts to understand when different contracts within the organizations are set to expire, to renew. And this information that is typically highly unstructured becomes important to business processes, but is difficult to extract without manual intervention. Now, within the Ephesoft platform for dealing with unstructured content, we're using machine learning in order to identify not only what type of document we're working with, but also to extract individual pieces of information from these documents. So I have one of my samples here. It's an amendment to an agreement, just a public contract document here. And what I would do to actually train the system and how I want it to recognize information is simply by clicking on any of these fields that are already highlighted on the document, or by creating a rubber band grab around a field to grab something that might not be highlighted. And if we see something highlighted here in purple or yellow, it simply means that the application is automatically recognizing that particular word or phrase as something that might be important to me because it matches a particular pattern. So for example, if I clicked on Dutra Cerro Garden Incorporated, the application is going to give me a predefined data type. So I see this drop-down menu and this little pop-up box that opened up. And it's going to make a recommendation that this looks like an organizational name based on the pattern, based on the format of this particular collection of words. And so I'm going to say, yes, this is in fact an organization name because it meets that pattern. But if, for example, this isn't an organization name, but it's just a generic name for contracts, or maybe in fact it is a country, or maybe it represents any of these other particular data types that the application is going to recognize out of the box. So in this case, I'm going to say, yes, this is an organization name. It's a predefined type, or I can create my own data type if I'd like. I'm going to go ahead and call this this field I want to train as party number 2. That I want to extract this field and call it party number 2. Say it's mandatory for any of these type of agreements. I want to use keyword extraction, which means I want the Ephesoft platform to look at all of the words that exist around this particular field to help weigh the confidence of where it's pulling the information from. And I'm going to say, okay. And just like that, the Ephesoft platform is going to look at this word and it's going to start defining all of those back-end dimensions for how it's going to consider whether or not this particular word or phrase represents the variable it needs to extract from the field that I trained. Now there are other variables here too. We've got dates. Maybe it's important in a contract to understand, for example, when a contract has been extended or what the extension deadline date is. So I could simply click on fields and say this is the extension date. Say OK, automatically map this particular date field here, or I can use a different date field, more generic, if I know it's going to be formatted differently. Say OK, and I can do this with any of the individual values in this contract or with entire paragraphs. So for example, if I need to be able to pull out the entire paragraph here that represents consultancy fees or anything else like that, I can grab more than just individual fields. So moving on from extraction training to extraction testing is a very similar process from what we do when we work with classification. So in this case, I give some feedback into the system essentially, and then I'm looking for verification that the feedback I provided or that input that I provided is correct in how the application is going to define that learning model and that it represents the information appropriately. And so similarly with classification training, we recommend, somewhere between 7 and 10 samples, variations of an unstructured or highly variable document so that we know we are giving the application a good representation of variations that might exist. And we can allow the application to take into consideration what anchor values might exist around keywords for extraction, how content might be formatted differently or worded differently. And this is where we have a very intuitive user interface to be able to provide that training and get that testing feedback. Moving from training to testing, I can see here the different document types that I trained as a part of this particular teaching job. And I'm going to move from this master services agreement to the amendment agreement that we were working on in the fields that we trained. And I can see the different pieces of information that we had selected for extraction. So I've got the different parties associated with this contract agreement. I've got important dates. Maybe I also wanted to grab other pieces of information like sections of paragraphs, like certain monetary amounts. But in summary, what I'm doing is I'm trying to grab the most important pieces of information that are part of this contract that we can use in long-term contract management, whether you have an actual contract management tool or whether these documents need to be stored in a records management system for retention purposes, and information like who the contract refers to, what the dates the contract go into effect, can directly impact how long these documents need to be stored for. And so once I'm satisfied with the way that the application is training different documents, with the way that the application is interacting with the content that I'm providing it to interact with, I would move on and simply click the Finish Teaching Job button. And when I select this Finish Job button, what it's going to do is it's going to take this teaching job and it's going to add it to all of those other teaching jobs that I've created to help update the aggregate learning model. So now moving forward, anytime the application comes across a master services agreement, or in this case, an amendment agreement, It's going to take these new fields I've trained into consideration and also look for that information for purposes of extraction and classification. So now that we're satisfied with how we're actually creating the learning model for how the platform is going to interact with the unstructured content it ingests and comes across, let's take a look at what it looks like once we've actually performed all of the extraction and we want to view the data in real time. So I'm going to click on this Analyze tile here, which will take me to the Analytics Home tile menu. In the Analytics home screen, I have a couple of options available similar to the project home screen. In this case, I'm going to focus primarily on this Explore tile because this is going to give me a representation or data view of the documents that I just processed. So I'm going to click on the Explore tile, and I can see here that I have a list of tables, which is what we refer to as unique document types. So if I go ahead and click on one of these particular tables, maybe the Master Services Agreement or the Amendment Agreement, whatever the case happens to be, I can open up one of them. And I can see here the different values that were extracted as a part of my processing the sample documents that I showed earlier. So if I click on one of these document types here, one of these rows of data here, it's essentially just a representation of the information that we extracted from that particular contract. So essentially what we did is we turned the documents into tables of data. And if I click on the Show Details button, it's going to give me a vertical representation of that data instead of horizontal. And if I select any of these particular fields, what's going to happen is I'm going to have a little pop-up view of the information where it was extracted from this agreement. So in this case, I've got the payment terms, and then I also have, I believe, the actual payment information, which in this case is net 30 days. And if I click on other fields, it's going to take me to the different areas of that document where that piece of information came from. So it's a great way to visualize where the actual information came from that you've extracted from the documents themselves. And so on a large scale, all of this information that we've extracted can be filtered, can be searched, can be sorted, can do a contains within search to look for key pieces of data that's been extracted. And we can perform this search or this interaction from within the actual user interface here within the Ephesoft platform itself, or we can do so from a third-party application simply by routing the data that's been extracted into that final destination, whether it's a records management system or a contract management system. So in summary, we just reviewed how the Ephesoft platform and its tools for intelligent content capture through supervised machine learning can be used to help augment, support, and enhance contract management policies within any type of organization. Thank you for watching the video, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out via Brandon Campbell at ephesoft.com or check out our website at ephesoft.com. Have a great day.